Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping into the really complex arena of foreign policy.
We are.
Specifically, we're looking at a pretty intense debate recently between a prominent U.S. senator and a well-known media figure. It's all about Iran.
That's right. We're focusing on the senator's stance on regime change there, his views on military action, and this label he uses for himself, non-interventionist hawk.
Which sounds like a bit of a contradiction in terms, maybe. We'll get into that. It all stems from a YouTube interview that really put his ideas, well, under the spotlight.
Yeah, and our mission here really is to unpack that stance. We want to look at its coherence or lack thereof, maybe its prudence, and what the source material we reviewed suggests are some pretty significant potential dangers.
Dangers not just for the region itself, which is, let's face it, always volatile.
Always.
But also for the security of the United States. We're asking, does pushing for regime change while saying no direct U.S. military involvement actually add up? Does it square with his principles, or maybe more critically, with lessons from history?
That's the core question.
So what does this all mean for you, listening in, trying to make sense of all this complex information and these really high-stakes decisions? Let's start with a moment from the interview itself that was, well, pretty startling.
It really was. It jumps right out. The senator, who is, let's remember, advocating for fundamental shift in Iranian policy.
A huge shift.
Huge. He's asked a pretty basic question about Iran, its population, and he just says, I don't know the population at all.
Wow, okay.
And when he's told it's around 92 million, his response is essentially, well, I don't sit around memorizing population table.
Oh, that's quite an admission, isn't it?
It is.
The source material we looked at really hammers this point. How is it okay for a U.S. senator, especially one pushing for something as drastic as regime change, to lack that kind of basic top-line knowledge?
Exactly. The argument is that this level of, you could call it superficiality, maybe, it's a significant risk. When you're making policy decisions that could, lead to war or massive geopolitical shifts,
You'd hope for a bit more grounding in the facts.
you really would. It raises questions about the dangers of making these huge calls, particularly calls with military implications, from a position of admitted ignorance, however rhetorically you try to justify it.
It feels like a disconnect, doesn't it, between the big pronouncements and maybe the detailed homework needed.
A definite disconnect. And that
Yeah.
potential for unforeseen consequences because of that disconnect, it leads us straight into his theory for how this regime change is supposed to happen.
Right, because he does have a theory. He suggests that things like sanctions plus what he calls moral pressure.
Like highlighting human rights abuses, talking to dissident groups.
Exactly. He thinks that'll be enough,
Yeah.
that the Iranian people will just rise up and overthrow the regime themselves. A popular uprising, it sounds neat.
It sounds neat, maybe a bit tidy. The source material pushes back hard on this. It points out this recurring Western idea, this sort of fantasy of spontaneous revolution happening just because we wish it would.
Right, like it's just waiting to ignite.
Yeah, and that view often clashes with the reality on the ground in Iran. We're talking about a really robust, deeply entrenched repressive system. It's survived decades of crises, internal and external pressure. It hasn't been toppled by a popular uprising yet.
It's not exactly fragile.
Far from it. And the interviewer in this piece, he really pressed the senator on this. He brought up historical examples where banking on inside uprisings without serious long-term backing just didn't work.
Like Cuba, he mentions,
Right.
since 1959.
Exactly. And Venezuela Maduro is still there, as he put it. And the senator had to concede, basically, yeah, it absolutely is hard to make that happen.
So the idea that people power alone will just sweep away the regime seems to ignore, well, a lot of history and the actual power dynamics inside Iran.
It does. It often fails to grapple with the security forces, the institutional loyalties, the sheer complexity of that society. Revolutions, especially against hardened states like Iran, are rarely that simple or clean.
Okay, so if direct U.S. military force is supposedly not the plan for regime change, and this popular uprising seems maybe overly optimistic, how does he see this happening? Which brings us to this idea the source calls the subcontracted war.
Ah, yes. And this is where that non-interventionist hawk label gets really interesting, or maybe contradictory.
Because he says very clearly, I don't think we need to use military force to do regime change. Explicitly.
Very explicitly. But then, almost in the next breath, he gives unequivocal support for Israeli attacks on Iranian facilities, potentially using things like bunker buster bombs.
And he frames this as, good for America.
He views it as benefiting America, calls it a good risk-reward.
Okay, wait, how is that non-interventionist?
Well, that's the core question the source raises. Is it really non-interventionism if you're actively supporting and enabling military action by a close ally, using weapons that, as the source points out, the U.S. provides? It mentions the U.S. has specific bunker buster bombs and Israel doesn't.
Implying a dependence or at least strong cooperation.
Right. It paints a picture of essentially war by proxy. You're not pulling the trigger directly, but you're providing the means and the blessing for someone else to do it against a target. You also consider an enemy.
So strategically, what are the implications? Is it just a clever way to avoid direct U.S. casualties and costs while still achieving a hawkish goal? Or is it, as the source hints, maybe a kind of geopolitical cynicism, outsourcing the dirty work?
It lets you maintain that hawk image without being technically interventionist in the boots-on-the-ground sense.
Okay.
But the consequences, the blowback, the escalation risks, they're still very real, regardless of whose plane drops the bomb.
And that potential blowback, those consequences, that leads us to the big looming question. What happens the day after?
Critical question. If this policy somehow worked and the Iranian regime did collapse, what next?
Yeah.
The source material points out a real lack of any clear plan from the senator on this. What fills the vacuum?
Which is especially striking because, as the source notes, he himself has been very critical of past interventions precisely because of the chaotic aftermath.
Exactly. He talked about Iraq, right? How it got much worse after we toppled Saddam, leading to the rise of ISIS.
He mentioned Libya too. Gaddafi falls and you get radical Islamic warlords.
And Syria, which he called a mess, questioning if it's really better with Assad potentially replaced by extremists.
Yeah.
He sees the danger in those cases.
But seems less focused on it when it comes to Iran. That seems inconsistent.
That's the inconsistency the source highlights. Ignoring those very lessons seems incredibly risky. A collapse in Iran without a plan could unleash absolute chaos.
What kind of chaos are we talking about?
Well, think about it. Civil war is a real possibility. New radical factions, maybe even worse than the current regime, could rise up. There's the terrifying prospect of uncontrolled nuclear materials, a massive humanitarian crisis, refugees.
And all of that would inevitably impact the U.S., wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Directly.
Absolutely. Think migration crises, new terrorist threats spawning from the chaos, huge instability in global oil markets. The idea that you can just topple a regime like Iran's and wash your hands of the consequences. History suggests that's just not how it works. The day after needs a plan, and ignoring it is, well, negligent.
Okay, so this connects to another point the senator makes frequently. He often invokes Ronald Reagan.
Yes, Reagan's peace through strength. He explicitly says Reagan is very much my model for how to take on the Soviet Union.
But how accurate is that comparison? Does the source buy it?
Not entirely. It offers a more nuanced look at Reagan. Yes, Reagan was strong, used strong rhetoric like evil empire, but the source emphasizes Reagan was actually very reluctant to use U.S. military force.
Really?
Yeah, it points out, in 8 years, the biggest country Reagan ever invaded was Grenada, tiny island. And remember, the 1983 Marine barracks bombing in Beirut? Hundreds killed. Reagan chose not to escalate militarily in response.
Huh. So Reagan's strategy wasn't just about military might.
It was multifaceted. Moral clarity, yes, but also intense economic pressure designed to bankrupt them, as the source puts it, and using the bully pulpit, American leadership, to highlight Soviet oppression. It wasn't constant saber-rattling or proxy wars in the way the senator seems to advocate.
So the source suggests the senator might be using peace through strength more as a slogan.
Kind of, yeah. Less as a detailed strategic framework and more as a catchphrase to justify a confrontational stance, potentially without that comprehensive Reagan-style plan behind it.
And maybe echoing some of the less successful slogan-driven foreign policy approaches we saw after 2001.
That's the parallel the source draws. Is there real substance behind the soundbite, or is it just tough a talk?
Which brings us to another theme the source highlights. Perceived hypocrisy or double standards.
Right. It circles back to his criticism of the Obama administration's handling of Syria. The senator asked, essentially, how is it better to have lunatics who hate us in charge if Assad fell? A mere question about unintended consequences. But, as the source points out, he seems less troubled by that same risk, the risk of potentially worse actors emerging if the current Iranian regime falls without a clear transition plan. The concern for stability seems selective.
And the interview itself got into some related, pretty sensitive territory regarding U.S. allies, didn't it? Specifically Israel.
It did. There was a contentious exchange about U.S. support for Israel and the role of lobbying groups like AIPAC.
The interviewer pushed him on whether AIPAC effectively lobbies for a foreign government.
Yes, and it highlighted the senator's significant campaign funding from AIPAC alongside his very personal biblical motivation for supporting Israel.
He quoted scripture, apparently.
He paraphrased, saying, "Those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed," though he admitted he couldn't recall the exact verse when asked. And this whole exchange, according to the source, kind of unmasks how strongly held personal beliefs and potentially political calculations related to allies can shape foreign policy stances. It suggests maybe a lack of objective criticism towards actions by allies compared to those taken by perceived adversaries.
So you see a potential bias influencing the patriotic rhetoric.
This source certainly suggests that as something to consider how personal ideology and alliances might filter the application of principles like non-intervention or concern about regional stability.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. We've taken a pretty deep dive into just one, albeit very revealing, conversation about U.S. foreign policy towards Iran.
We really have.
We've looked at the senator's arguments, the implications.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen moments of, well, admitted gaps in basic knowledge.
Strategic ignorance, you could call it.
We question the realism of relying solely on popular uprisings for regime change. We explored the murky ethics and strategy of subcontracted warfare.
This idea of war by proxy, yeah.
We considered the potentially disastrous day-after scenarios if a regime collapses without a plan, reevaluated the actual legacy of peace through strength, and touched on the ideological currents potentially driving these policy positions.
It really covers a lot of ground, and it all boils down to a crucial question, really, for you, the listener, the citizen, trying to navigate this stuff.
It is.
In a world just packed with complex global crises, not to mention all the issues we face at home, how do you cut through the slogans? How do you demand more from leaders than just rhetoric? How do we push for actual strategic thinking based on real knowledge with a clear vision for what comes next?
It's a huge challenge. So maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. If knowledge truly is power, what kind of power are we as a country actually wielding if our foreign policy debates are sometimes built on admitted blind spots? Or if they lean too heavily on historical analogies that maybe don't quite fit the current reality?
What stands out most to you in this whole complex picture? The policy, the principles, the pragmatism, the potential pitfalls?
Lots to think about. We encourage you to keep asking those tough questions and demanding clear, thought-through answers.